Thank you all for being here. My name is Afshin Molavi. I'm a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. In fact, that was where I first met Professor Fouad Ajami. I was a student doing my graduate work in the mid to late 1990s at SAIS, and so I really got to know him in those years. And when you get to know someone as your ustad, as your teacher, as your professor, it's certainly a different story than the Fouad Ajami that we all saw on the screens, the Fouad Ajami on CBS News, the Fouad Ajami in the pages of the New Republic, the Fouad Ajami in the pages of Foreign Affairs. In fact, when I was there, I referred to those years as his Bosnia years. These were the years where he was very actively engaged on issues related to Bosnia. He was leveraging his entire network around issues related to Bosnia. He would come to class animated about Bosnia, and we would joke and say, this is a Middle East Studies class, and he would tell us that we need to be focusing a lot more attention on Bosnia. Now, the other thing that you notice when you spend time with him is you notice that this is a man who not only wrote in poetry, even though these were prose essays, he spoke in poetry as well. When we would, you'd have an office, a routine office hours visit with him. Things to you like I would be having trouble with my Arabic and I would be telling him that maybe I should be doing my strengthening my Persian. He would say, your season of Persian is over for now, and he would continue to, and I thought was wonderful, you could not graduate from our master's degree program without doing the proficiency in Arabic. But I think what we all appreciated when we were his students is he was charming, witty, he was very funny as well, but his one-liners encapsulated a world. And when he would say things that were very simple, but they ended up really just kind of encapsulating so much of a particular country or a particular region. And we took to calling these Ajami-isms. And there was one I remember in particular. He said, in Syria, we have to decide who will win, the Alawites or the satellites, right? And then he would go on, and he would also talk about Syria, but in the context of the broader region, he would say that in Syria you rule or you die. There is no post-presidential book tour. There is no visit with Oprah touting your memoir. But these were kind of off-color, off-the-cuff jokes, but they had real truth in them. They were deep. They told a story. One of my favorites was show me a balcony and I'll show you a dictator. And so when I got to know him in that context, a little bit different than the context that one would see him on television, one would see him in the pages of Foreign Affairs. But I never knew him in this context. And this is an extraordinary book, When Magic Failed. And I urge you all to read it. And I wish Michel Ajami could be here. Michel Ajami, his wife, and his intellectual collaborator on so many of his works, but certainly on this work, because this work was, like many of his works, a work that had it was on yellow legal pad paper, all handwritten. And in fact, he was thinking of publishing it while he was alive. They chose to not to do so, and then after he passed away, Michelle revived it, and I'm really glad she did. It's an extraordinary book. I'll share my thoughts with you on the book as well, but I do want to turn it over to my fellow panelists here. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with Franck. Maybe I'll start with Franck Salameh. Franck Salameh is a professor of Near Eastern Studies and chair of the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies at Boston College, and is the author most recently of The Other Middle East, and also Lebanon's Jewish Community, Fragments of Lives Arrested. Franck, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Afshin. I thought perhaps since you gave us some of the Ajamisms that I would start with aphorisms that are not his, but that I think he would have appreciated, especially speaking about where he comes from, Lebanon. He would have said, I think, Lebanon is a place that one leaves, not a home where one settles into. Because that's essentially what he did, and that's what many Lebanese of his generation and my generation have done. So I thought it would be appropriate to open my remarks with an aphorism like that. He was famously, obviously, a fan of and an elegant purveyor of such old world wisdoms. But aside from that, he might have indeed been destined to this ancestral Lebanese habit of exile and peregrinations. Lebanon is, as he describes it in his memoirs, is a place of repose, a place of rootedness, but it's also a passageway where people come through and leave. And that's exactly what he would do in his later years. He would leave carrying with him the wrinkles of his old world and bringing us his magical, methodical way of demystifying that old world. As an interpreter of the Arab condition, Ajami's life and his work was, in a way, an act of defiance as well as discovery of peoples and himself. He wrote of the Arabs' hang-ups and predicaments, but he also wrote of their promise and salvation, as if he were writing his own life story. Looking for America and falling for America very early on, he left Lebanon as a youngster, barely 18. He wasn't even 18 yet, chasing after the dreams and promise that America held in his imagination. And this is an America that he encountered as a pupil at an American school. He gobbled up the best that America was dishing out on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. His America was an accessible culture that he'd acquired and possessed with intimacy and zest, that he could not, in his words, that he could not have duplicated for the culture of France, which also was accessible and available in his Lebanon, but in his words, it was one that had been claimed by the country's Christians whose traffic with France went back centuries. So I guess as a non-Christian, he was left with America. His America was the America of, as he describes it, an America of missionaries, of schools, of engaging educators with a crew cut and a narrow tie and glasses, who taught without bullying. It was an America of irreverence and free inquiry and skepticism. It was MGM's Roaring Lion at a movie theater. It was Harry Belafonte records playing in a classroom. It was a faded pair of Levi's jeans with the coveted red label on the back pocket. He describes it with such precision. He speaks a great deal about the signé in Lebanon, the culture of signé, having to buy clothes, that come from a certain designer. And the Levi's that he describes is something that the Lebanese covet a great deal because there are a lot of knockoffs. So the Levi's with the red label on the back pocket was very important, as he describes it. That America was also the America of his own young American teachers, one in particular that he speaks of, who brought them stories of buying an old clunker and driving from coast to coast, counting the cars on the New Jersey Turnpike, looking for Simon and Garfunkel's America. He throws us all of these little, cultural nuggets of America in an amazing way. It was what he calls America was savoring the language of the Inglese, the English, waiting for assembly, waiting for PE. It was the joy of my first locker, he says, and the sounds of such American platitudes as, okay, see you later. You have to be a guest of the English language to appreciate the way he describes these Anglicisms. So Fouad caught the bug very early on, a bug that would burrow deeply into his consciousness. When in later years he would find himself attending a Lebanese Muslim school, where instead of thinking critically, pupils his age were taught to resent America without being given a reason as to why, and he's very clear about that. One of his teachers, an Arab nationalist author and petty demagogue named Omar Farouk, very well known in Lebanon, took special kinds of thrills hectoring and sermonizing his charges about what he contemptuously called cowboy culture, and Fouad reproduces it the way it is pronounced by this teacher, pronounced kaiboy. So he would contemptuously describe this kaiboy culture and look at Fouad, kind of waiting for him to respond, and he would say, "Wouldn't you say so, Fouad?" Sort of putting him on the spot, to kind of validating the teacher's own kind of malignancies and resentments, which Fouad in later years would describe as the myth of anti-Americanism. It's perhaps for these reasons that Fouad Ajami had, and you'll see this reading the book, had no soft spots for Arab nationalism. Nationalism in general, he was not a fan, but Arab nationalism specifically, and what he calls Palestinian gunmen, the poster children of Arab causes, who were strangers, gharibs, he put in Arabic, to the children of his town of southern Lebanon. They were gharib, strangers, staking claims to lands that were not theirs to have. Likewise, those Lebanese who crossed the Lebanon-Israel border and dealt with the Jews, in his words, the Yahud, were, to him, in his telling, were just Lebanese being Lebanese, even as Arab nationalists would have labeled them as traitors. Nationalism did such things, he wrote. It declared things permissible and impermissible. It gave them names and endowed them with morality and immorality. But this morality had not yet come to Arnoun, the name of his southern Lebanon native village. Like him, his own mother, and he probably sort of took that from his own family, she also had no particular affection for Arabism and its cause célèbre. Two kinds of people, she used to say, you can never trust are the communists because they don't have a God, and the Palestinians because they have no land. So the passion of nationalism that in his words made the plight of the Palestinians an Arab burden was not an occupation for his family and his village. Indeed, save for Lebanon's Sunnis, the Lebanese, by and large, except for the Sunnis, the Lebanese were not particularly enthralled with the notion of Arabism and were ill-prepared to pay its poster children more than tepid lip service. Fouad's father, like I imagine other Lebanese of his generation, was probably selling guns to the Jews. But there was also the havoc that Arabism and Palestinianism and their hang-ups had reigned on southern Lebanon, the area from which he comes, the Shiite heartland of Lebanon, essentially. Moving to Beirut, Fouad was socialized at the Armenian quarter of Burj Hammoud, which was a refugee camp at the time that dated back to the days of the French Mandate, 1920, 1921, and it was initially a refugee camp. A slum that over time turned into one of Beirut's most industrious, enterprising commercial hubs. He was fascinated by his encounters with these Christian Armenians. He writes, the Armenians were light years ahead of us. In the heart of their indigence and suffering, not even a decade since the trauma of the Armenian genocide, the Beirut of the Armenians boasted theater companies, relief societies, schools, libraries, churches, political parties, soccer clubs, literary societies, factories. It was there in the Christian ghetto of Burj Hamoud that Fouad would become a city slicker. He would rub shoulders with Christians and learn their ways, mingle with drinkers. He writes, Armenians were drinkers, but they were also a hard-working, energetic breed. It was also in the Armenian ghetto that he would savor his first mortadella, getting the thrill of not only, as he puts it, tasting the meat of the khanzir, the pig, but also testing on his tongue the sound, as he put it, the glamour of the foreign word, mortadella. While the Armenians cared for their own, rebuilt their society out of nothing, he kind of speaks with a touch of resentment of the Palestinians who were also refugees in Lebanon, but did not go the way of the Armenians. There is a story. I should probably begin wrapping up, or? Okay. There's a story that was particularly striking to me because I'm reading this also as somebody told me when they read the review that this is more than just a book review. It's probably an autobiographical essay. I see a lot of the way I grew up in Lebanon as somebody from a different part of the country than Fouad's. I see a lot of my own upbringing in what I read. And this one in particular, the story of the Arabic language that Fouad speaks of and describes as the cruel tool of Arabism and Palestinianism. An element of the Arabic language, which he mastered, by the way, but the nationalistic element of the language that he sought to indict in his own writings. He calls it a grim, dogmatic language, a world removed, almost different, a different language from the one that we spoke at home. And he describes his Arabic teachers. Arabic, he says, was inculcated through physical beatings. It was the language, quote, of the ancestors, of the Quran, of the classical poets, of the men who ruled, of the terrifying speeches that they had given, of the commands they had issued. It had its own weight and terror. As teachers stood by with their canes at the ready, a few lashes from the cane were an easy punishment. Students were beaten, kicked, slapped across the face. There were floggings for those perennially in trouble. We vowed to do better in Arabic, end quote. But this was a dead idiom, as he wrote, a grim desert language of abandoned desert campsites and a remote universe that was not his own. We were in the city, he wrote. The experience of the desert was not ours, and neither was its language. Still, Fouad, as I said before, was a master magician of the Arabic language. He mastered it without resentment, without judgment. He even pilfered some of the magic of the Arabic language into the elegant English that he wielded. He also had a soft spot, it seemed to me at least, for Lebanon's Christians, although as a child of Lebanese Shiism he might not have been supposed to, but he might have also inherited his family's irreverence, refusing to be a supposed casualty of martyrdom and passion and tragedy, the expected norms of traditional Lebanese Shiism. His aunts and uncles, he tells us, were schooled by local nuns in southern Lebanon, and there might have been, he says, there might have been a priest somewhere in the background of his family tree. Indeed, as a teenager, Fouad would eventually find his way into a Christian boarding school in Beirut, actually in East Beirut. He writes, and East Beirut is very important here, with a church and an abbot, a gentle soul who loved conversation and banter and who paid us, the few Muslim students, special attention, made sure we felt at home, end quote. More importantly, perhaps, Ajami's given name was Fouad, a borderline name, as he put it, not the patently Shiite Ali or Abbas or Hussein. It's often said that our last names usually tell the story of where we come from, our lineage. Our first names usually tell the story of where our parents want to send us. And Fouad makes that very clear about the choice of his name. His parents, he tells us, wanted him to walk undetected in the world of strangers.
And Frank, if I may, there was one line in the book that was extraordinary where he said, about origins. He said that, we are always, we are always from Arnoon. No matter where we go, we are from Arnoon. And then he has this line was, "There goes Fouad, grandson of Sheikh Mohammed." You remember that line? Yeah. So maybe if you could just wrap up here, and then we'll turn to Hussain.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me just wrap up with where he is today. This is from the end of the book, and it's a very, very moving passage. Banished from an unforgiving land, he writes, at a young age, the name of Arnoon would remain with him regardless. And today it is etched on his tombstone. I haven't seen it, but I'm describing what I've read in the afterword. I think it's Michel who wrote this. So Arnoon, it is on his tombstone. It is in a small graveyard in the countryside, in the American countryside. We don't know where. And this graveyard turns into an ocean of American flags on Memorial Day. It's an American graveyard where his neighbors in eternity are veterans reaching back to the Revolutionary War. I can't think of a more dignifying tribute to the life that he chose. And I imagine there isn't a tribute he would have loved more than this one. We bury our ancestors close by. They watch and we remember. Those were the last words that Fouad Ajami's grandfather told him before he left for America in 1963. We bury our ancestors close by, they watch, and we remember. So Fouad is indeed, as he would have liked it, among his kinsmen and ancestors today. He watches over us, and we remember him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is. Thank you very much. It is an extraordinary sight. I have been to the tombstone, and Michelle Ajami really honored him with what she did there. So let's turn it to Hussain Abdul-Hussain. He's a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He focuses on the Gulf region, on Yemen, and he also grew up in Beirut, much like Fouad Ajami, of a different era. And he wrote an excellent review of the book, and he's a journalist and author and writer on many different topics. Hussain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Afshin. So I'll just pick up from where Frank ended about the first name and the last name. The first name being where your parents want to send you. So if you're Hussain Abdul-Hussain, then it's my parents were saying, you kiddo are staying here in the Shia country. This wonderful book, I'll start with the book and then I'll move to my journey with Fouad Ajami. As I read every page and every line, I had the feeling that as if I was the one who had written the book. It just speaks to so many things, and Frank probably feels the same, but I feel more so because, like Fouad Ajami, I grew up in that same Shia countryside in Lebanon, and my parents moved to Beirut, like his parents moved to Beirut, and we had similar cultural shocks after moving to Beirut. And after getting in touch with so many things that were inaccessible to us in the Shia countryside. And this is a journey that takes you, it took me at least on the exact same pathway that took him. So you start as a supporter of Pan-Arabism and a fan of late Egyptian President Abdel Nasser, And then you keep on evolving, and then you end up on the other side of the political spectrum. And that's exactly what happened to him, and that's exactly what happened to me, of course, with a few decades between the two of us. And when I went to the American University of Beirut, Fouad Ajami was the devil, and of course, because that part of the world is Edward Said land. So I loved Said and I hated Ajami. And then the evolution kept on going on until I became a fan of Fouad Ajami, especially after I moved here, with exposure to his amazing thought, ideas, deep thought, amazing language skills. And like Frank, we're probably the few in this country who were not his students or who never met him in person, but we were somehow in touch and we communicated. But as I read this book, he brings out the Shia characters the exact same way that I grew up with them. He brings up all the trouble that he had to go through when he moved to Beirut, all the suppression of analytical thinking. And by the way, it's funny because he went to international college and I did the same. So even in high school, we went to the same high school. And the bottom line was for Fouad Ajami, and this became the bottom line for me, is that the big headline in Lebanon and the Arab countries is that we are living in misery, and the party responsible for our misery is imperialism, the United States, Israel, in this order or any other order, but these guys are responsible. We have to beat them, and after we beat them, everything will be great. And that was Fouad Ajami's original way of thinking. That was my original way of thinking, and then we changed, we grew out of it. And now he thought, now I think that it's from within. And when you read this book, you understand the problem is from within. Even if all these actors disappear overnight, even if the United States disappears, even if Israel vanishes overnight, these Arabs will be living in misery. And I say this because this is out of personal experience. I'm half Iraqi, half Lebanese, and I spent my first few years until age 8 or 10 in Iraq. And we were forced out of Iraq, and my thinking was that Iraq's biggest problem was Saddam, and if we remove Saddam, the country will just become a democracy, a superpower. And then in Lebanon, we had a similar idea that Israel was occupying southern Lebanon, and when Israel withdraws, Lebanon will just become another democracy and an amazing superpower. And these two things happened when I was still in Lebanon, and nothing changed. In fact, Lebanon now is much, much worse compared to the years when Israel was in South Lebanon. The country is in free fall. And the same thing happened in Iraq, to the extent that people like me who wanted Saddam gone every minute of their lives, now they're thinking, are we sure this was the way that we wanted things to go on? So Ajami's conclusion, my conclusion, is that the problem is within, fixing it is within. And it's not in this book, but if you read Ajami, you will get to the conclusion that he had an issue mainly with Arab intellectuals. And I think this is where probably the clash with Edward Said happened, because Edward Said was the exact opposite. His whole idea of Orientalism and to blame the West for not understanding that part of the world, that was the total opposite. Now, Ajami never wrote or never spoke about his personal life. I was not aware of anything of a personal life, even though I had been reading him and watching him, and I had been his fan for so many years. And this was the first time that I got a peek into his personal life. And this was the first time that I understood that the man grew up, the man knew the country, he knew Lebanon, the way he calls these Armenian soccer teams. And he knows which team belongs to which Armenian political party. He knew the country inside out. And when you compare this guy who knew the country inside out, and he was saying, our problem is within, to the guy who went to Victoria College, who went to New York, who grew up here, who learned Arabic at age 30, in this case I'm talking about Edward Said, then You make a guess. Who's the local and who's the Orientalist? Who's the guy who knew what was in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and who's the guy who was looking at Lebanon and Syria and Iraq from his office overlooking the Hudson in New York City? So this journey for someone like me to switch sides from Team Saeed to Team Ajami was exactly the idea that we have to switch from thinking that the problem comes from outside the Arab world to thinking that it's within. Fixing it should come from within. And intellectuals, especially intellectuals, and we're talking about this forum, and there's another forum in the country, and we disagree over this exact issue, that intellectuals are not playing the roles that people like us who grew up there, who got access to literature, to thinking, to ideas, that these people are not playing the role. These people are just propagating the ideas of whoever is in power, or the ideas of whoever is doing I don't know what in that part of the world. Intellectuals are failing. Ajami didn't like it that intellectuals were failing. He stood out as a minority, but he's a minority that I chose and I defected to, and to my mind, that minority is saying the right things, much more than the majority that thinks of itself that it's the party that's standing on the higher ethical and moral ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussain. And I think, you know, you're right. Not only did he give us a glimpse into his personal life and his life growing up, but he gave us into a glimpse of what an observer he was of the inner lives of others. You know, in fact, I think he could have had a career as a novelist. You know, the way this read. In fact, one time I was in his office and he said, you know, there's one career that I actually do envy, and he said it was V.S. Naipaul's career. So I think he had that novelist in him. So let me turn to Nibras Kazimi. Nibras was formerly research fellow visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute. He directed the research bureau of the Iraqi National Congress in Washington, D.C. and Baghdad, and was a pro bono advisor to the Higher National Commission for Depacification. He is the author of Syria in Jihadist Eyes, A Perfect Enemy. Nibras, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I had a very similar reaction to Hussain's when I was reading the book. I'm going to talk about 3 things that stood out for me from this book. 2 were immediate, and the third, because I had to come up with something to say here. The first one was, yeah, I don't know Fouad Ajami, all right? I'm reading the book, and you get the sense of, I thought I knew him, all right, but I didn't know about, and I'll get to this word later, something that really stood out for me. I once tried to start a conversation about his background. I told him, oh yeah, I went to Arnoun. He's like, oh, so you did. and then he was like, did you go to the castle? Yes, I did go to the castle. And then there was a little pause. And then I said, oh, I heard something about your brother, too. And he's like, you know what? He had a smile and he changed the subject. And I'm like, okay, this man does not want to talk about these topics. Now, given there's not much to say about Arnoun itself, too, all right? The word that stood out for me when I was reading the book was integrity. It would have been so easy for Fouad to leverage this story. I mean, the guy doesn't only just come from those areas, he really comes from, I mean, propaganda had worked for me, against me. I thought Fouad, I mean, had a tangential relationship with the Shiites of Lebanon. He grew up in Burj Hammoud, I mean, that's Armenia, basically, all right? So what, you know, but no, when you read the story, he comes really from that deep thicket of Lebanese Shiism. Not only that, there's something that struck me when the poverty at times that he lived through, and that the word victimhood. I mean, his mother was emanating victimhood to him all throughout his life, and she was a victim from the story that we hear. And Fouad himself could easily wear the badge of victimhood, like with the highest merits and colors. I mean, and he could have leveraged that, let's say in 2004, when I think in 2003 there was this awful write-up about him, really nasty. I think it was Adam Schatz, New Yorker, basically describing Fouad as an arriviste, parvenu, an opportunist, somebody who's hungry for power, Shia nationalist, all these things. I mean, Adam Schatz is coming from the pro-Said camp, but yeah, in this rivalry, as Fouad as the anti-Said. First of all, I don't think it's fair. All right, Said is too meager of a foil, I think, for Fouad. But let's set that aside. It's easy to bash Said in this crowd, so I'm going to refrain from the temptation. But at any point when the arrows grew thick in his direction, he could have leveraged the story and shut everybody up. All right. I mean, in a world where, in a new world, much of it, actually Said's legacy, which has become this woke world now, this badge of victimhood, this ability to adorn these vestments would have been, immunity, would have defended him from any of these attacks. And things like the word arriviste would even polite circles where it's still, I mean, in these conversations about the Middle East, it's still okay to be derogatory about Shias, apparently. But, I mean, people would have held back, I think, with this story. This has authenticity. He does come from that background, and he comes from the hard-scrabble, difficult life of growing up in the Middle East. Now, setting that aside, what is this book? This book, the value of this book, scholarly value of this book, is that there's a line in there. First of all, he starts with this story. I'm not going to give any spoilers for people who haven't. There's, what was her name? Dalal? The cousin? That grips you. I mean, that's right there from the beginning, and you're like, okay, this is different. He's being a little bit too honest, all right? Talking about family secrets, the things that don't get on the record, in the historical record, in a lot of cases. And then there's a sentence that he opens with, I think it goes, I was born among a rural people at a time when the balance between man and the land had eroded. He's describing or exemplifying the story of his family to show several things, to show the movement from the countryside to the urban centers, phenomenon across the Middle East, the shedding of the old ways, of the old narratives, of the old clothes, of the old idioms of the ancestors, a break in some cases, like Dalal's case, this move to Burj Hamoud, but it's not really, it's even a Shiite enclave in Burj Hamoud, and it's a fascinating, it's the tools of a historian being applied to a family history, all right, and being applied with integrity and honestly, and we are getting to see some details personifying these big arcs in history, personifying them in names and in characters, this migration to West Africa, the migration to the Gulf, trying to get, find a buck here and there, and it's sprinkled with all these little stories, the things that fall through the cracks. For example, in his own life, as a historian, he must have lived with this terrible, nagging feeling of not knowing why Zahir, Shirazi, whatever his name was, left the Shiraz or the environs of Shiraz, went, of all places, to Arnoon, all right, bought some land, all right, and whatever stories and secrets Zahir had did not transmit to his son, Sheikh Muhammad, Fouad's grandfather, because he dies when Muhammad is 3 years old. So all that is gone. We hear this tantalizing tale of a brother to the great-grandfather who ended up in Aleppo, who became a Sunni, all right, and was a Sunni imam, and the brothers find each other at some point. We get a little bit more of a glimpse of the grandfather, Sheikh Muhammad, and whatever progeny he may or may have not left in Uruguay, all right, in Montevideo, and it's really, I mean, this is just maybe too granular here, but there was this one little thing there. For example, he talks about a cousin called Munir, the son of Najib Bey, Alawiya, who became the sidekick. He was one of these Shiites families who left sort of more of a notable bent, the Alawiya, compared to Fuad's own family. But they leave the countryside, the hinterland. They go to Beirut, and he gets well educated in all the right schools. I think he goes to St. Joseph. He starts working in the customs office, and then he hooks up with organized crime, with Sami al-Khoury, the biggest trafficker of his day. I'm reading this and I thought I knew something, but I've never heard this story. I go looking for Sami al-Khoury, whatever happened there. There's a book by, I think, Salim al-Lawzi about him, the Jordanian journalist. I can't get a hold of it, but it's tantalizing. And then both Munir and Sami al-Khoury disappear in Jordan because they run afoul of another smuggler who happens to be a member of the Jordanian royal family. I want to know more, all right? Where do I find this? And this is the kind of stuff that we get through these family histories. So I started asking myself, was this book unique in that it's the craft of the historian being applied to a family history and being published, all right? I mean, family histories are sort of denigrated in academia. This is the work of people who go to Ancestry.com, who do some, hobbyists in genealogy. But there's immense value in hearing these stories from people who know this craft. I mean, imagine if Iri Kaduri had left us with the story of my family, all right, or Hanna Battatu, or the other big names in this field. There was huge value. I think a big precedent, at least when it comes to the Middle Eastern story. I've seen, for the purposes of trying to work out whether this was unique or not, I looked at some of the scholarship that's there. When you have these elements of the historian's craft, you see a lot of memoirs written by historians, and sometimes they're denounced as navel-gazing and narcissism. It's mostly of why I'm so good at my job, how I became so good at the craft of the historian, rather than telling the story, a small story of the small characters within these big historical movements. So honesty, brutal honesty in this case, being careful with information and how memory works, and our field, which is the Middle East, North Africa, or these places. I put this out there. Maybe somebody can tell me of a similar attempt as this one, combining these three elements. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm gonna turn it over to you. But just as you were talking, Nibras, I looked at my own notes, and when I was thinking about this book, so much of this is the story of modernity versus tradition. I'm remembering the great line from Gramsci, right? The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born, and the interregnum, the morbid symptoms appear all across this landscape. Old structures were dying, and new ones were struggling to being born. And Fouad Ajami, he chronicles that for us. He chronicles the new struggling to be born. But there was a hidden thread, and I'm sure all of you noticed it, and you brought it up with Dalal. There was a hidden thread of empathy for the women that he encountered in his family, and you saw it throughout the book. And there was just one passage I wanted to highlight. It was on page, let's see here, 205, where he says, He says, young women couldn't see some of the sensitive boys around them. No, sorry, here we go. There was springing up in the relations between young men and women in my world a new kind of tenderness and protectiveness. What was a realm of conquest was becoming a realm of shared vulnerability. Young women couldn't see some of the sensitive boys around them writing poetry but hiding it from their fathers. By the way, Fouad Ajami was one of those who wrote poetry, and when his father saw his poetry, said to him, this is really, he didn't actually say it to him, but the message was conveyed to him that these poems of love are not manly. One should write of politics and of Lebanon and of the, rivers and mountains. And he said, young men couldn't see the young women juggling different centuries in the air. Juggling different centuries in the air, getting beaten for walking onto the balcony, for using the family telephone as somewhat malicious schemers. Young men and women became fellow sufferers in a world of repression and yearning. And the book is just full of passages like that, where he understands the struggle that so many of that we're facing. So here, I want to leave it all to you.
Afshin, if I may just piggyback on this, because there's his description of the Olim, which he could see the Jewish pioneers that he could see from his village, and the entire village could see, and this was, to him a nearness out of reach, and there's an element of yearning for these people. Because they're the polar, he sees them as the polar opposite of the women that he encounters on a daily basis, and he writes of how from his village he could see the Hula Lake drained by Jewish farmers who tilled the land and wrestled with the malarial swamps. Jewish pioneers, men and women, who worked the field side by side. And then he goes, with the women with bare thighs that the riders from our village glimpsed from afar and marveled at. But this was an intimation of another world, right? And there's, as you read this, there's an element of not only a little boy's fascination with something new, but almost plain admiration. And I think I encourage you all to go back and read this passage, because it is, I think it fits very well into what you were saying.
And the book is for sale, right, Asaf? Just outside for those. Okay, so let's open it up to all of you for questions. We have about 20 minutes or so. Yep. First one. Don't make me calling. No, okay, I'll have I'll do, yes, go ahead.
What do the Lebanese here make of that Riyadh al-Sulh was living there in Arnoun, had his house right outside, all right, and Fouad only mentions his dogs barking at the people entering or exiting the village. And Fouad, Riyadh al-Sulh is founding father of the Lebanese polity, one of the founding fathers of the Lebanese polity. The stories of the marriages of his daughters, I mean, this should have loomed large in the minds of the Arnounis, and it's completely unmentioned. I thought this was odd as a historian that he'd leave that out.
That, Southern Shiites living in the indigence on land owned by the Sulh family is something that we don't know about, we don't hear about.
I just thought he was trying to be nice, because many parts of the books he really falls down on so many characters, and I mean he didn't want to just trash everything and say you get the impression that he eventually left because he thought this is beyond repair. And to Afshin's point on women, this is from the very first page that he had sympathy toward his mom, which was left with 2 children living in poverty. So it was clearly throughout the book that the only thing that meant to him in Lebanon was his mom. And I asked Michelle actually about the title, and I thought that she had picked it. She said no, it was written on top of the block notes. And apparently, because our friend Michael Young wrote a review wherein he came up with the idea that when magic failed meant the country failed or something. But when you read the book, you understand that when magic failed was that the mother tried to keep his dad, not go marry someone else, by giving birth to Fouad. And after she did that, she still couldn't keep the father, and he was the magic that failed in keeping the marriage together. So I think he was really harsh at so many points. Correctly so. He was not being the guy who was going after people unjustly. But at some points, like you're saying, if he went all the way, he'd probably he would have required another 2 books just to take down all these Salah and Co.
The three of you, I mean, this was also in many ways, a story of a son coming to terms with his father, a son coming to terms with his mother. I mean, there was a beautiful passage where he writes, "My beloved mother, I do know of the hellish years you spent in my father's village, of the back-breaking toil. I know that my father's face reminds you of Imam Hussein's killer. It hurts me to no end to know what it was like, to think about how much you endured." And then he writes, "I live amidst the tales. All I want is for the tales to release me from their grip. If this is infidelity, so be it. I very much want to be your son, shall always be so, but I don't want to appropriate your sorrow and your defeat and make them mine. Surely in your galaxy of imams and their sayings, in your endless supplies of parables and proverbs, there must exist the possibility of a life lived without man being hunter or prey." I mean, this is the kind of, literature that this is in this book. And just reflect on that for a moment, the universality of this. You talked, Nibras, about how this is an important book in our field, but I think it's an important book in the field of urbanization studies, right? I think it's an important book in the field of memoirs, family histories, fathers and sons. These are universal themes.
I didn't get the feeling that he came to terms with his father, okay, because I didn't come to terms with the father. He left the reader really wanting to punch his father, it's the one thing that struck me in correspondence with Michel is that he was working on this for 40 years. He was writing up little notes, early in the morning, and just setting them aside. Right? So it was an exercise of in the second edition of the Arab Predicament. The second edition came out in 1991. Arab Predicament came out in 1981. So a decade later, he says several things in the introduction. Maybe as an answer to all the people who were criticizing him and for that book, his seminal book. He says, "This book was not written by a stranger, right? In a very intimate way, it is the story, it is my story and the story of my generation." This is the Arab Predicament. And then he says something that the bonds, being far away and being in a far land and time, did not break those bonds between me and that land. So, he tried very hard to break these bonds with Lebanon. There's, again, no spoilers, but he leaves in 1963. In 1973, we learned that his grandfather was very important in his life, the father figure, or the better father figure than his own father, dies a decade afterwards. He doesn't come back, apparently, for the funeral, but he comes back accidentally for an hour in the transit lounge of Beirut airport, and he feels suffocated. All right? And this is 74. The country still hasn't gone to crap. All right? And we don't get to know what brings Fouad back, this grappling over 40 years, right? We have glimpses of where his intent was, but clearly it never succeeded. Also, I think, going back, he tried to not absolve the father, but tried to forgive him. I don't think it worked out either.
No, it doesn't feel that way. And when I remember that line about origins and there goes Fouad, grandson of Sheikh Mohammed, you think of him, walking the Council on Foreign Relations. That's not what they were saying about him at the council. They weren't saying there goes, but he brought he brought, his story of Arnoun and his identity back, and he brought it into, and I agree with your point that he could have worn this as a shield against all of the critics. And maybe I want to ask each of you, do you think time has made those, maybe not the critics, but a broader public appreciate, some of the truths that he told us in The Arab Predicament and some of his other works? Do you think, time his books have aged well? Maybe I'll start with you, Frank.
For a certain public, I think his books have aged very well. I mean, the Arab Predicament, especially for me, but I think the lines are still drawn, and he's still the devil for the sadists. I'm copying Martin because he's the one who coined that term, the sadists. Right? I'm not mistaken. This is yours. Yeah, I think it has aged very well for us, especially when you bring the topic of in his book Introspection and Self-Criticism. I mean, the line that keeps coming to me from the Arab Predicament is, when Hussain spoke about if you remove everything, if you remove America, imperialism, things will be all fine and dandy. But he says, the problem is within us, and the line that he uses is, the whip is quite able at cracking at its own, and that's what essentially is happening. So I don't think there has been changes on the battlefield. The line is still where it had been 40 years ago.
One sentence from the close of the book: a new world storming in with a vengeance, that the Arnounis feared, as they had always feared the unknown, loomed over the horizon, over the old slights and the limits they knew. This book certainly offered us a new world into a man we all knew and admired, and I thank you very much, and I thank Asaf very much for putting this together. Thank you.